Thank you all for coming to our 2018 election candidates night. We are lucky to have 2 contested races. I think that's probably good for the town to get a contested race and to get some debate and discussion about issues. So tonight the purpose is to have the opportunity to talk to each of these 4 gentlemen and see where they stand and give them an opportunity to express their points of view. So I'm going to just introduce by name the 4 here. We have 2 men running for the Board of Selectmen, Robert Sikansky, who's our incumbent, Joel Meyerson, and then we have the 2 gentlemen running for the school committee, Dave Yezwe and Mike Corritt. The format we're going to use tonight is, first I'm going to ask each one of these candidates to give a 3 to 4 minute overview about themselves, just to tell us all who you are, what you've been doing with your life, and what brings you to Bolton. Whatever you want to share is great. We'll keep that to 3 or 4 minutes each. And then we'll do a set of questions for one board first for about 20 minutes. And I would ask that each question be directed to both candidates for a particular board. And we want to have each person be able to answer each question. And then we'll go to the other board after that. We'll flip a coin to see who goes first. And then after that, we'll give each of the candidates a chance to make a closing statement, and hopefully that will, give us an opportunity to hear a lot tonight. And I'll just, as the moderator, try to keep the meeting moving along and call on people to ask questions. If anyone doesn't want to ask a question, but they'd like to write a question down, we do have some paper in the back, and we'll ask the question for you if for any reason somebody doesn't want to personally ask the question. So why don't we start with introductions, and I'm going to start with Bob right to my left here.
Good evening, Bob Sikansky. I've been a resident of Bolton for about 25 years. I've been active in a variety of community affairs, most notably on the advisory committee for 6 or 7 years. I chaired that committee for a couple of years while I was on it. I think the notable accomplishment of that time was we slowed down the rate of growth of town expenses so that there was actually a growing gap between the maximum amount of money that the town could tax the population and the amount of the actual tax. When I first joined the advisory committee, we were taxing to the maximum and using surplus cash, called free cash, from the private sector in order just to balance the budget. After leaving the advisory committee, I was on the Neshoba Regional High School Space Needs Task Force, a committee put together by the school committee. When Superintendent Wood left, I became the chairman.
Seats up front.
I became the chairman of that committee, and a couple of years ago we issued a 41-page report on conditions at the high school, of which I was the principal author. And that report is available on the Neshoba School Committee website under the Space Needs Task Force. More recently, earlier this year, the school district was preparing what's called a statement of intent, a request to the Massachusetts School Building Authority for assistance in evaluating and possibly remedying conditions at the high school. They asked me if I would, based on what I had done as part of the high school task force, if I would contribute to that and write part of it, but particularly the areas around the conditions that we surveyed when we were writing our report. So you may know that last Wednesday that report was accepted by the school committee, and it is going to be submitted to the state in order to request assistance from the MSBA for the high school. Beyond that, when I moved to town, there was no Little League here. I think it was Chris Collins started the baseball league again. I did some umpiring and coaching the first couple of years of that. My kids, I was very active as an adult leader in the Cub Scouts. I was very active as an adult leader in the Boy Scouts. I was treasurer of the Boy Scout troop here in town until last June. And in my church, I'm on the Board of Deacons. I'm chairing we're going through what they call an interim search, a search for an interim minister right now. I'm chairing that committee. And I've been past chairman of the property committee, the stewardship committee, and things like that at my church also. Thank you.
Well, that's very impressive, and I can't say that I have that long a record of community service, but I moved into town in 1983 and almost immediately started getting involved in town government because as somebody who had been a newspaper man, a reporter, an editor, and even a publisher of a small weekly, I was astonished that there seemed to be only one source of news about Bolton, and that was something called the Bolton Citizens News, which was a little monthly that went out to everybody in town. And I started covering the Board of Selectmen for that. I met Ken Troop, I met Charlie Brown, I met Chris Slade, and all the usual suspects, because at that time we had a small Board of Selectmen and there was almost, I don't think there was a single contested election. I served as editor of that publication until it ceased publication when a private newspaper, I think it was the old Bolton Common, came in. But anyway, we in the Citizens Association decided it wasn't fair to compete against somebody who was trying to get a business going here in town. I followed town affairs for quite some time, and I joined the Conservation Commission back in 2002, served for 3 years there. And then in 2014, my name was brought up for the advisory committee, and I've been on advisory since then. And I've been looking at the process, the painstaking process of trying to keep the budget under control in the face of amazing forces that are moving faster than we can possibly cope just by cutting line by line in the budget. We just can't continue to go on by cutting the budget. I really think that advisory and the 3 selectmen and our town administrator and the town accountant and all the department heads, we really work very hard following on the guidelines that Bob's board established to try to keep the budget growth within bounds. But we're facing an awful lot of pressures, and I really think that we can take some reasonable steps to broaden the tax base. We're doing that now. There are some bylaws that the planning board has put in this year's town meeting warrant that will help make Bolton more friendly to business. But frankly, I don't think that the ideal business is going to come here that has millions of dollars in taxes without too many employees, without generating traffic, without polluting. That business doesn't exist, or if it does exist, I doubt it will end up here in Bolton. But that helps. We can pass a meals tax, which is on the warrant and which I favor, and the selectmen and the board, the advisory committee also favors. We can pass a bylaw that allows recreational marijuana production in Bolton, and I favor that because, again, that's taxable. The planning board has endorsed a warrant article, a zoning bylaw that would permit commercial level marijuana cultivation under strict state and town regulation. And I also supported the citizens petition article that would allow small-scale marijuana cultivation in town, not because I'm in favor of, well, when I was in college in the 60s, maybe I was different, but I really haven't partaken in a long time, but because I think it gives an opportunity to local entrepreneurs and possibly to farmers, even though the state does not consider cannabis to be an agricultural product. And if any such small-scale growing does take place, it will also add to our coffers because that will be taxable. But above and beyond that, I think we're still gonna face problems in the near and not so near future that simply can't be solved by cutting and cutting and cutting. The town, there's only about 4% of the budget that we have control over, and we've been doing a great job of keeping the budget, the growth of the budget under control. But there's a long list of things we're going to be dealing with in the future. How do we preserve our rural character and agricultural heritage? How do we deal with the fire department's staffing needs? How do we regulate the traffic flow on Route 117? How do we build town reserves in anticipation of school upgrades and unexpected opportunities or challenges?
Okay, thanks, Joel.
Okay.
We'll get into a lot of these things more deeply.
Yeah,
Let's try to keep it to introductory. Thank you. Dave?
Thanks for having us. My name's Dave Yasway. I'm running for a vacating seat on the school committee. I was born in town in 1980. I was educated here, K through 12. I went on to college in Boston. I studied economics and math at BC, and I returned to the area in 2002. I rented a house for a couple of years in Sterling, saved up money for a down payment, and bought my first house on Woobly Road. I always wanted to get involved, and very shortly after moving back into town, there was an opening on our town's housing authority. I raised my hand and put my hat into that ring, and operated there for a number of years. I wanted to get more involved. That's a relatively sleepy board within the context of our town. An opportunity came up on the planning board, a vacancy, so I threw my hat in that ring. Got very engaged, learned a lot, had a lot of fun. Very shortly after I joined, the chairman at the time had an opportunity to run for selectman. He did so. He won the contest, and that opened the chairman's seat on the planning board. I was voted in unanimously, and year after year since then held that position. I stepped down, and very recently. My term is about to expire this year, and I'm looking for the next challenge. I've got a couple of kids who are following in my footsteps, my older brother's footsteps. They're in the district. They're young kids, pre-K and kindergarten. One is a typically developing peer, my older son. My younger son, Ben, is in he's on an IEP, he's in our SPED program. And we're enormously grateful to have the educators that we have in town. Miss Christine is his teacher. She's my guardian angel in a lot of senses. My professional background is in, and always has been, in commercial real estate banking. I worked first in Worcester and subsequently in Boston, where I commute to every day now. I wake up at the crack of dawn, beat all the traffic, and I would have it no other way. A lot of my peers at work and in the industry kind of prod at me a little bit for commuting so far. Many of them live closer to town. But there's a reason I make that choice. This is home. It always has been. It always will be. This is a great town, and we're super lucky to have the volunteers that we have in town. I think sometimes they don't get enough credit. They all try to do really, really hard work. In banking, in my career, I finance 8- and 9-figure commercial real estate developments. And the next challenge, as I see it, in the district, in the Neshoba Regional School District, is one that we haven't faced in 2 generations. As Bob indicated, we have filed the paperwork, statement of interest to the Commonwealth, pleading our case for a replacement high school. I urge everybody to read the document. It's very, very well thought out. It's very well detailed. It's very factual. It's very objective. And at the end of the day, this is a major, major challenge that the entire district faces. By my estimates, it's a $125 million capital project among the members of the district that they'll go through. And it's an opportunity. The school that we have now is tired. It's 57 years old. It's been effectively depreciated. And I give the teachers, the administration, the school committee, all the credit in the world for keeping it together, band-aiding it, so to speak, with a lot of paper clips and bubble gum. But we're at the point now, I consider myself fiscally conservative, and we're at the point now where we're throwing money at it, and it's not producing a lot of the outcomes that a 21st century type of facility should. There is a way, and this is kind of the focus of my campaign, to balance excellence with efficiency. We've always, as a community, been very, very lucky. We've had families that demand excellence, and very often we strive for efficiency. But right now, where we are with that property, there's a lot of aspects that have us throwing good money after bad. HVAC systems are falling apart. The level of energy and utility we put into the place to heat it during the winter is very, very challenging. I very much look forward to being an integral part of that process if I'm fortunate enough to be voted in by the town. Like I say, it's going to be a gigantic challenge for us, and I think we can accomplish 2 things: an absolutely excellent 21st century learning environment, as well as some serious efficiencies. Nobody, whether Republican or Democrat, on the far left or far right, enjoys seeing our heating dollars flush out those doors. That's only one small concern with the property. Like I say, I give everybody around it all the credit in the world, but it's time to dive into the next stage. We've started that process through the statement of interest very, very methodically and carefully. That's got to be a big challenge, and I believe nobody's poised better than I am to roll up my sleeves and help in that effort.
Thanks, Dave. Michael?
Well, thanks very much for coming out tonight. I know it's a Wednesday night, and for a lot of you it's difficult, especially if you have young kids. So thanks for coming out. My name is Mike Horish. I moved to Bolton 7 years ago. I am a husband. I'm a father of 2 children. One is in kindergarten, one is in 2nd grade. I'm an educator by trade. I have taught for nearly 15 years. I've taught most recently 10 years at Lexington High School. As a science teacher, I came in as an earth science teacher. Got my licensure for chemistry, and I'm working on my licensure for physics, trying to sort of experience everything in the world of science. So I've been there for about 10 years. Prior to that, I was an educator in upstate New York in a small town not far from where I grew up, Eastridge High School. And before that, I was an environmental consultant in Boston. I did that for a few years. And I guess what I like to do is just sort of bring together sort of the 3 points why I feel like I'm poised to represent the town as the next school committee member. Having been an educator, I'm seeing sort of both ends of the spectrum in terms of what a strong community leads to as far as academic achievement and academic success and what support feels like. And then on the other side of the coin, my first district, where a school had a lot of challenges and how that was connected to a lack of support. And so I've been fortunate enough to experience both and understand those connections. Having been a teacher, having been a consultant, I've had a pretty wide variety of roles that I've had to find myself in. I worked closely with a pilot program in Lexington to integrate kids on the autism spectrum into general education classroom. That was a pilot program that's now sort of well established in Lexington. Working very closely with kids that come from out of district, in the district, trying to understand their needs and the cultural differences that they experience. I have been on countless committees, advisory boards, a mentor for several teachers. And so with each of those roles, I find myself learning quite a bit, learning how to communicate, not just with students, but with other faculty members, with staff members, administrators, superintendents, school committee members, and all that has tremendous value in my opinion. And then the last thing I'd like to bring together is sort of my membership within the community. Again, I'm not a lifelong resident like Dave, but it occurred to me several years ago that rather than funneling all of my energy and experience into Lexington, I would sort of bring that back here so that my kids could benefit, and so that their friends could benefit as well. So as a community member, I started coaching a few years ago. I coach my kids' soccer teams, both my daughter and my son. Coach their baseball team, but not their t-ball team. I'm currently on the school council at Florence Sawyer. We're working on a school improvement plan, which is largely based on the schools, the district's goals. I'm on the board of the Bolton Youth Baseball and Softball League. I tutored some of your kids, so I try to offer as much as I can in the community because I have a tremendous amount of respect for the rurality of this community and the nature of the residents. And so all three of those things together, the education and the roles, and my community membership, I feel like will really put me in a really great position to help make decisions that will lead to student achievement, sound school policy, and working within an operating budget. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Great.
Doug, want to let these people go sit?
Sure, if anyone wants to sit down, we do have some seats in front. And if you want to pull them off to the side, you can do that too. Okay, so we've had introductions. We're now going to do two 25-minute sections, one on selectmen and one on school committee. So we're going to decide which group goes first. I'm going to let Joel call it. Heads or tails?
Tails.
It's like heads to me.
Heads. So we're going to go school committee first. Who has a question for the school committee members? Yes.
I guess I'll read it, it'll make it a little bit easier. School committee candidates, how will your experience or lack thereof on other local government boards play into your seat on the school committee? Does that make sense?
Sure. Mike, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thank you for the question. You know, when I think about what it means to be on a school committee, I really go back to teaching. As a teacher, what I'm doing is I am really thinking about what's best for my kids in my classroom. And on a broader scale, what's best for the kids within my district, what's best for the educators, the people that I work with, and really what's best for the community. So, you know, when we talk about local government and a school committee being a component of local government, I don't see it as a government position. I don't see this as a political position. I see this as an extension of education. And not having the experience in local government almost gives me sort of a fresh perspective. And it gives the perspective of someone who is inside the walls of a classroom and inside the confines of a district, of a building. And you know, I have to ask myself all the time, this past month and a half or so has been, there's been a lot of time I've invested in sort of researching and looking at documentation and budgets and school committee minutes. And I have to ask myself if the things that I'm gonna have to give up for this, that I have also chosen to invest in my kids' future, if that's gonna be worth it. And as long as it's worth it, then I think that this is a worthy pursuit. And do I have to give up being involved in coaching? Maybe. Is it gonna take more time out of my schedule to be home with my kids and my family? It probably will, but I have to keep going back to that question. And in my opinion, being a school committee member is really just an investment in the education of the schools or the district's biggest resource, and that would be their children.
Thank you.
Thanks. Dave?
Thanks for the question. My experience in the town, I think that's most relevant to this, two of the three boards that I served on. Capital planning, which reports to advisory, it's an appointed board, and the planning board, which I was probably more intensely involved with because of the position as being chairman. On capital planning committee, pretty consistent with my work financing real estate. We looked at big ticket items. We balanced must-haves with good to have, nice to have type of priorities. That was a lot of hard work. It was very nice to have everything that was put before us, but in the confines of a strict budget, we had to make tough decisions in our recommendations to advisory. So, like I mentioned earlier, as we embark upon really a once-in-our-lifetime type of expense within the district, among the three communities that are part of the district, that type of discipline to get that balance between an excellent asset and efficient control of resources is absolutely paramount. I'll switch gears a little bit and talk about my role on the planning board. I'm very happy with a lot of the accomplishments we made there for very, very different reasons. And I think it would help on the school committee for very, very different reasons. We fostered an environment that was a lot of hard work. The result was very open communication, where folks were able, willing, and very, very much invited to come to all of our meetings and speak with us outside of meetings about everything that concerned them. And it made for very long agendas at times. There were times when we would get home from meetings at 10:30 or 11 o'clock on a start time of 7:30. The point of our layout, of our format, was to discuss a series of topics that were posted in agendas that were published prior, just like the school committee does. Where we differed a little bit is in our period allowing for interaction. And it wasn't an aside, I can say, and I'm only speaking for the planning board and what we accomplished there. But that level of interaction was the focus of the good work that we did. We asked for feedback, and boy, we got it. And sometimes it was very positive and supportive. Sometimes it was tough feedback. But hearing the community talk to us about what was important to them, what wasn't important to them, what was concerning to them, what needed to change, helped us prioritize. This is a very interesting form of town government that we're lucky to have here in Bolton, where the decisions are absolutely made by the citizens at regular meetings every 2 weeks, at special town meetings, at annual town meetings. The business is decided by the vote. And what we do on committees is listen, engage, and steer conversations. We prioritize based on feedback. That's very, very important, and I think that's a terrific best practice that I'm very, very proud of, and that continues today within the planning board under Eric's leadership. And I think that's a best practice that any one of our boards, including the planning board, can continue to learn from day in and day out. So if I'm lucky enough to, fortunate enough to be voted in, I would very much welcome slowly introducing that type of a perspective into the committee.
I just realized this is gonna flow a lot better if we could now do a question for the selectmen, so I'm gonna change my format. So the next question will be for the two selectmen. Who has a question for the selectmen candidates? Yes, please.
Okay, we talk about what we would like to have, and we talk about what we need. So I am going to talk about the need for a senior center. The present senior center that we have is getting to the point of being inadequate. The space is leased, there are restrictions on it. Office space has been reduced. Some seniors find the building unwelcoming. The kitchen does not meet health codes, so that we could not prepare congregate meals at the center. Back in 2006, the COA formed a committee and did a lot of work investigating a new senior center. That conversation is starting to happen again. I attended an ADA focus group meeting today, and one of the things that was brought up was we need, and it's no longer a senior center, it's a community center. And so I would like to know from the candidates is where do you sit on a senior center? It doesn't have to be new, it can be rehabbing an existing building if one happens to exist. It's going to cost money, and it may cost a lot of money. And I don't want that thrown out first, because we know it's going to be a money issue. But priority-wise, where do you see a senior center fitting in to the list of what we need in town?
Joel, would you like to go first?
Okay. I think I see it somewhere in the middle of our priorities, and that doesn't mean that it should be thrown out. I think that we need to address some bigger overall issues first, and we need to figure out a way to start setting aside contingency funds and so forth. We've started to do that for the new high school that we know is coming. But the senior population is definitely one that needs to be addressed. I am a senior, although I don't like to think of myself as one. So I would say that it is somewhere in the middle of the list of priorities, and I would recommend we try to find a building to refit if it's possible. We do need a community center too, because Bolton, we have a common now, but we have a library, but Bolton has had a difficulty keeping its community status. When I moved into town, there were fewer than 3,000 people in town, and the town felt much closer knit than it does now. And seniors can feel isolated, so that they need a place to assemble, and it could be a place for community meetings. So I would put it in the middle of my priorities somewhere.
Having just completed a budget cycle and having reviewed a bunch of capital projects, some of which has been brought up in past years and maybe got passed over then and got passed over again this year, it's difficult for me to place this properly because tonight's the first time that it's come up, the first time that it's been presented to me as part of any discussion or budget. I don't know the details of what the conditions are at the senior center. I believe the building's only about 20 years old, is that right? Or maybe less than that?
No, yes.
Okay, it's
a
about
new
20 years
building.
old. So certainly there should be some study, some better understanding, and there should be some public discussion of what the conditions are there, what the shortcomings are there. Expanding that into a community center or into a community center discussion, what I would like to see before we discuss building a community center is more of a community center program. Rather than build a put up a building in expectation of filling it later. I'd rather see a bunch of programs developed that would lead us to say, we need some dedicated space for this. Now, the way I see doing those programs would be, I believe that there's a lot of empty space in that office building at the intersection of 495 and 117. I believe there's also a lot of large empty space down in some of the buildings down by the Stowe line, some of the old factories. And I would like to see the town, perhaps the Council on Aging could work together in conjunction with Parks and Rec to put together some kind of intergenerational program that they then monitor and use some of that. We could rent some space from those locations to put together programs. And if there's a wave, if there's continuity, and if it grows, then I could see creating a dedicated space. But at this point, I can't see creating a dedicated space just to hope something happens there. I believe that if you're young, if you're a child, if you're in school, if you're in high school or late grade school, there's basically nothing to do in this town, particularly since you're really dependent on automobiles to get anywhere in here. So I would like to see more programs put in place for kids in the elementary schools and the middle schools. I'd like to see a couple of the playing fields. For example, Derby Field behind Florence Sawyer, that's like concrete during the summer or during the fall. I'd like to see that refurbished and made usable year-round, and the same with the, I believe it's the girls' field hockey team down by the old horse ring. Is that field hockey or lacrosse?
Both.
Both. I'd like to see that made into a real playing field with proper fencing around it so people don't go driving through the middle of it and stuff like that. And that would give us some more opportunities for young people in this town. I'd also like to take a look at the land we already have, and could we clear a little bit of it and make small playgrounds in different places during town, so not everything gets concentrated down in the center.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, next question for the candidates for school committee.
Yeah, you don't set the budget for the school. I'm sure your advice is asked for, but over the last decade at least, the same dilemma has come up. The total town budget is kind of fixed, not kind of fixed. The town budget is fixed. The school staffing costs, because of pensions, because of health costs, because of salary raise, is going up at a rate greater than the town revenue is going up. We've dealt with that issue for at least a decade, and the reality is it's probably going to continue. Some of it's been done with, let's say, diddling around with efficiencies. Okay, we're going to put more students per classroom. We're going to cut back on some small budget items. As the school committee, where are you going to push back? Or are you going to advocate for? I'm sure everybody's going to try to do a good job, but do we try to enhance the teaching staff, recognizing that those costs are going up? Do we try to keep pushing on efficiencies, that is, dealing with some smaller line items? Or are you going to be advocating for, hey, we need to get a bigger chunk of the total pie, the town's budget, allocated to the school? Which dimension would you tend to push at?
Dave?
The chunk of the pie is already growing. I mean, in years past, we were in the low 60s, and we're approaching the mid 60s, and that's a little bit scary. For me, and I'll harp on about these words over and over again, I think it's a balance of excellence and efficiency. I think at the end of the day, for decades and decades, these communities have enormously valued the educational experience. It's what drives the popularity of the town. It's what drives property values to be where they are. But hard questions have to be asked, and prioritization has to occur. That only happens with a whole lot of dialogue. and a whole lot of open space for folks to come into meetings and say, it's the beginning of budget season, and a collaborative process. Let's chart out everything for which money can be spent, and let's prioritize. We work within a budget and start from the bottom in terms of must-haves versus like-to-haves versus it would be nice to have. Hard decisions, very, very hard decisions. I think with respect particularly to the high school, I don't care who you are and what your position is, it can't make anybody happy to see such things as the HVAC system at our high school runs in as if occupied mode throughout the night on cold nights so that pipes don't freeze. This is nobody's fault, right? But this is what we are dealing with a 57-year-old. To start investing in our property, plant, and equipment, especially over there, Lawrence Sawyer is in a totally different situation. But to invest in it there such that we're not needlessly spending money on items that nobody wants to spend money on. I think that's another piece of the question. So it's about prioritization. It's about dealing within the confines of a budget. It's about recognizing that excellence is something that has drawn every resident that I know in town to this community. But it's got to be balanced, and balance leads to some pretty difficult questions sometimes. For me personally, this is my background. This is what I deal with constantly. So when my clients come to me and they have a proposition for a new asset that they want to develop, we all take a hard look at feasibility. Does this make sense? Are you getting the value for the investment that you're putting in? I think, like you said, the personnel around our district do a hell of a job rolling up their sleeves and doing everything they can do with what they have. There are certainly items on which we spend money that don't make anybody happy. To ask those hard questions and find those, to prioritize what's most important, I think that's the answer. It's not easy work.
Thanks, Dave. Mike?
Yeah, so great question. Certainly not one with an easy answer. The school committee, as you said, the school committee does not build the budget. The school committee reviews it and hopefully passes it. So when we look at what the budget offers, it would be difficult to monetize the budget, right? In other words, to look at the budget and say, we're going to define what we spend on the school strictly in terms of numbers. If we look at different line items within that budget, behind each of those line items is a program, there's an intervention, there are teachers, and ultimately there are students. And so the budget is, in fact, really tight. It is growing. I think it grew, I think the fiscal year 19 budget will have grown somewhere around 4%. At least from Bolton's perspective. Similarly for Stowe, about 5% for Lancaster. And so I think as a school committee member, I need to remember that I am one of 8, and I'm also in a representative position. And so I'm supposed to represent my, my town, and that's what I would be tasked to do. And so I would expect of myself to be a part of a conversation about what our priorities are and what we should be investing our money in, and what requires shifting funds from one place to another. But it's difficult to answer a question like that without understanding where that money is allocated to begin with. I mean, do we ask health services? Do we trim away from there? Do we trim away from athletics? Do we trim away from special education? That's something that is ripe to have conversations with my other school committee members. And that's the kind of dialogue that I value. And invariably something fruitful comes out of really engaging dialogue like that.
Thanks. If anyone wants to sit in front, there's a couple of seats here. I'll just keep saying it. Next question will be for the Board of Selectmen candidates. Yes?
We
I think conversations in Bolton oftentimes go round and round about how we can control costs. And one of the things that I have noted that does to us is that it really stifles creativity. The excitement here comes in getting angry at each other about expenses, not in the joy of doing something exciting and wonderful in our town. And so what I'd like to ask you both is, what innovations do you see for increasing revenue in this town?
Bob?
I see some opportunities in planning board articles that are going to be on the warrant this year. We have a mixed-use overlay district now. It was passed at town meeting. It was considerably amended at town meeting to be very restrictive, and as a result, it hasn't been used at all. The proposals by the planning board are to broaden the footprint of buildings in that mixed-use housing, which I think will make it more appealing. There's also a similar proposal for just the commercial industrial areas, allow bigger footprints of buildings and so. We have a limited amount of industrial and commercial property in Bolton, and it does make sense to get the most tax money out of it that you can. I'd like to go on and say that there's an additional aspect to commercial and industrial property that's I don't think commonly understood. If I'm away from my house for 6 months, my property taxes don't change. Whether I'm there or not, my property taxes are fixed. You take that large office building at the intersection of 495 and 117, depending on whether it's full or empty, its property taxes change. Because if they're getting revenue, then that building is worth more, and we can tax them more. So you take the same building and you fill it with people who are paying rent, we will get more tax revenue from that building than if it stays empty. And the same is true for the other empty buildings over by the Stowe lawn. So we've got real estate available that people don't want to use. And I don't think it's understood that if those buildings were used, more tax revenue would come into the town. Why aren't those buildings used? I hear two stories. One is no amenities. There's no place to go for lunch, for example. Now, we have Slater's, we have the renovated Country Cupboard, we have Bolton Bean, we have Classic Pizza. If that office building at the corner of 117 and 495 were full, all of those would be overwhelmed at lunchtime. But we make it very difficult for any other establishments to come into town. So amenities and things like that would be a big plus in terms of, first off, they alone would provide some tax revenue, but they would enhance the ability to attract companies and raise tax revenue in those otherwise empty buildings. The second issue is traffic. I heard one story, I don't know if it's true, that a company over by the Stowe line had an employee quit after 3 weeks because they couldn't get to 495 in time to pick up their kids after school. Once they got to 495, it was a straight shot to their after-school daycare, but they couldn't get to 495 fast enough because of the traffic on 117. So that's another obstacle in our way. So amenities primarily, and increasing the footprint of buildings, and I know we're all talking about traffic, but those are things we can do to enhance the revenue stream here in Bolton.
Well, I discussed a couple of ways to enhance the revenue stream when I was giving my long-winded introduction, and I'm sorry for that. But we've got the items that Bob mentioned that the planning board is doing to encourage businesses, and presumably some of that may encourage some other amenities to move into town. And we have the we have the meals tax, and we have our source of potential revenue from cannabis. But I don't see any of those as being a salvation. I think what we need, you're talking about creativity. I think what we need in terms of creativity is to reach out to everybody in this town, get people involved in government, communicate with people better. Not that we're not trying, but I think that an awful lot of people look at our town government as a closed circle, the same people meeting in the evenings, discussing things that people don't understand, and then all of a sudden they get their tax bill and the blood pressure rises. Well, I don't have an answer, but I think one answer that I do have is, having been a journalist for almost all my professional life, I think I can help reach out to the citizens of this town, let them know that their input is really welcome, let them know how the boards and so on operate, and invite more participation. It's difficult. We have an excellent little local paper, but it's not that well read, and it's not that local. I think maybe social media would be a way of doing it. There are other approaches that can be done, but the other thing we need to do, and I hope that I could do that, is we need to respect all kinds of points of view, and that means I will take input from anybody, whether I agree with it or not, and if the people seem to want something, I will try my damnedest to get it enacted. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Okay, next question for the school committee candidates. Yes.
Yeah, so far David's been pretty comfortable talking about finances and facilities, and Michael's been pretty comfortable talking about education. I'd like you to switch roles, and I'd like David to talk about what his educational priorities are, and I would like Mike to talk about what his financial and facilities priorities are.
Well, that's a really good question. So, you know, like I said earlier, I've just invested so much time trying to kind of understand this this beast that is a school district. I mean, it's so complicated in so many ways. And if I'm going to echo where Dave's position is, a couple of weeks ago I set up a tour at the high school. With Principal DiDomenico, and he set aside about an hour. We toured the entire facility, and he was gracious enough to be very objective about it, without trying to insert his opinion. We of all things, a science teacher ran into another science teacher, and so we spoke a little bit. And this is just a little snapshot of what the facilities are like. This was a chemistry lab. There was one hood for 10 labs. There was an exterior vent that was probably about 15 inches in diameter, where kids who were making solutions had to bring their stuff over so that it could be vented properly outside. If it was windy, she had to talk over these flapping vents, and if it was snowy, snow was actually coming into the classroom. And it's difficult to, it's both difficult and incredible to see a school that is held in such high regard work under such difficult conditions. It's not dire, but it's not in a place where it's getting better. And so one of the questions that I kept asking was, well, how do we attract more families to Bolton? And one of the drivers, one of the reasons we came was because of the school system, because it was strong. My kids are in school here, and they're going to go to school here until they graduate. How do we attract the right educators? You know, how do the facilities reflect our values? So this SOI has been submitted. It is potentially on track to be considered for further review. and that gets the process started. I think that is going to be a tremendous driver, and it's effectively going to be a game changer. I'm currently involved in the visioning process in Lexington, where we're sort of considering a new building. And so what that means is that it's a tremendous opportunity. When you have a new building, it's a tremendous opportunity to reflect on how you want your school community to be set up. How will kids interact with one another? How will teachers interact with one another? What kind of common spaces and meeting spaces will there be? And so of course it's a tremendous expense, but it's this tremendous opportunity. And that addresses so many of these other ancillary questions about what we do to pull people in and get strong teachers here and how we retain them. And so, if we're on track for potentially a rehabilitation of our building, there are so many other factors that can move in positive directions as long as we're thoughtful about them, and as long as we solicit the input from the rest of the community.
Thanks. Dave?
I love the question because it's an opportunity to kind of see the other side of both of us, maybe not the side that would be most glaring superficially. I'm very, very fortunate. My parents raised me very, very well. I give them all the credit in the world, myself and my brother. My wife is from Stowe. She went through the high school. We won't hold the fact that she's from Stowe against her. I'm not doing this because I can't afford the taxes and I need the taxes to go down. I don't mean that to sound like an arrogant statement, but it's very true. I did a lot of soul searching towards the end of last year. Think about how was the best way to give back to my community. I think I'm leaving the planning board in an awesome, awesome space, and I want to do the next thing. I care more about my 2 kids than anything else in the world. And you can't explain that to somebody who doesn't have kids until they do have kids. This is going to sound terrible, I have one kid who I don't worry terribly much about, and I have another kid who I do worry a little bit about. And the quality of the education here, I need to make sure has that level of excellence that it had for me and my brother when we were a Carnegie accredited school in the 80s and in the 90s. That's why my parents came from Hudson and Stowe into Bolton to raise us back in the late 70s, early 80s. And it's why I'm sticking around for the long term. So my acumen is in finance and it's in commercial real estate development, and I think especially right now, I can lend that expertise amazingly well. My heart is doing it for an enormously different reason, and it's for, selfishly, my 2 kids.
Thanks, Dave. All right, next question for the Board of Selectmen candidates. Yes, Bob?
Yeah, I've listened to all this conversation about nice to haves, must haves, good to haves, et cetera. And I hear this, I've heard it for 42 years in Bolton. And it's basically annual wrestling on a tactical level by individual boards coordinating with the advisory board to come up with the best solution. Back in the early 2000s, we put together initially a strategic plan, which became a master plan. And to be perfectly blunt, the whole government, as well as the town, is running with an out-of-date roadmap. I think it would be very, very important under the leadership of the senior element of town government, the selectmen, to very, very urgently revise or completely rebuild the master plan so everybody is on the same footing, understanding the same perspective from a very wide range of input from the community, and use that as the basis to make much more strategic decisions on a tactical and annual basis. Questions for the selectmen. Do you see this being an urgent issue? And are you willing to take a leadership role in your position on the board to make it happen?
Amen.
Joe?
Well, that was, the master plan revision or complete rewriting was one of the things that was in my long preamble and probably shouldn't have been there. Obviously, we need to anticipate where we're going and what we're going to be facing. And the best way to do that, and the best way to bring the whole community together, is to update that plan and make sure that we get as much input as possible from as many sections of our community, from old and young, from the people who don't usually show up except maybe at town meeting, the people who, when I met them at the the transfer station, asked me when the election was or when the town meeting was. We need to get them involved. It's, as you say, we need to become much more strategic because we've been much too tactical for much too long.
Answer the second part of the question.
Would I be willing to take the lead?
Yes.
A woman by the name of Pat Gray brought this up last fall. There was a joint meeting between the selectmen and the advisory committee where she presented an overview of the 2006 master plan. And she indicated a bunch of areas that needed updating. The selectmen and advisory at that time agreed that something needed to be done. I think what happened after that was Camp Virginia moved to the center of the stage, and then the budget moved to the center of the stage. I would certainly be in favor of moving forward with a revised master plan. Some of the assumptions it makes are clearly outdated and incorrect. And if we're, if we were to be following it now strictly, it was good for its time, but it needs to be updated. I'd like to throw out on the table, though, one aspect of this. Now, the planning board, at least nominally, has ownership of updating the master plan, at least nominally.
Thank you.
But having been on the advisory committee for 6 years, 6 or 7 years, and now being in the selectmen through a budget cycle, I can say with confidence that advisory and the selectmen work within a certain set of parameters each year in terms of the revenue that's available for us to spend, the amount of taxation that's possible, that kind of thing. What those parameters are, that's set by the planning board. And that's an aspect of the planning boards that really hasn't been paid a lot of attention to. I think they're starting to focus now on the economic effects of their decisions, which is why there are some articles on the planning board now. But the overall parameters of where the revenue is coming from and how much revenue is coming from those sources is not up to advisory. Advisory has to take that as a given. It's not up to the selectmen. The selectmen have to take that as a given. Those parameters are set through the planning board and then voted on by you. There is a division of the state known as the Division of Local Services. It's part of the Department of Revenue. And they have this amazing section of their website that's got 2-3 dozen spreadsheets, which are arranged to be compatible with each other. So if you want to take this data and compare it over here, it's very easy to just copy and paste and pull stuff together. There is no city, town, or municipality in the state of Massachusetts that depends more on tax revenue to pay its bills than Bolton. That has been the case in 7 of the past 10 years. We're number 1. I don't think we'll be bragging about that. But nobody in the state particularly has a history of depending more upon tax revenue than us. In terms of residential taxes, we're number 3. No municipality in the state depends more on residential taxes to pay the bills than Carlisle, Alfred, wherever that is, and Bolton. Per the DOR website, Bolton's per capita income is about 72,000. Carlisle's per capita income is 123. They have a lot more disposable income than we do. So I think they can absorb that being at the top of the residential thing. Alfred, I know nothing about Alfred except it has less than 500 people who live there. So I think there's sort of a statistical fluke that got them into the second place. But we've been up there in the top 5 for well over a decade in terms of relying on residential taxes to pay the bills. And that is basically a decision we have all made by the votes we've cast over the past 15 to 20 years, okay? What's the planning board is putting forth now is not gonna change a whole bunch in the next budget cycle. But it will start the process of unwinding some of that. Now, it's a start in the process. The best way to do the process is to update the master plan so that you've got a comprehensive view of how you're going to relieve the tax burden on the residential portion of the population. But there's nothing in this proposal this year that's going to be disastrous if it doesn't, you know, it'll fit into the master plan. It's not so huge that it won't be amenable to fitting in the master plan. So does that answer? Okay.
In part 2, what would you lead?
Would I lead? Yes, I'll be happy to support that.
Thank you. Okay, now a question for our school committee candidates. Neil?
Thanks. So I have a real life situation that I'm going to pose to both candidates. Thank you both for running. It's true that we're looking at these crazy challenges with rising taxes every year. We have a budget which is 78 to 80% controlled by employee salaries and benefits. We've been working with a level service budget for the last several years with the school district, really not throwing many new initiatives or doing the wish lists that so many educators would want. We've got a challenge right now where the high school, as both candidates have pointed out, the high school's in horrible condition, and we need to determine whether we're going to refurbish the high school or build a new one. Either way, we're looking at many millions of dollars. We're reaching our debt service limit for the town quite quickly. We have Proposition 2.5 that's in place, which requires debt overrides for anything that exceeds that 2.5%. So all of these together provide some substantial challenges. This year, if the budget is passed by the town, we're going to have an excess and deficiency balance of roughly $600,000, one of the lowest points that it's been ever. The current full-day kindergarten is running at a deficit despite the fact that it does collect tuitions for that. That deficit will probably cause E&D to be drawn down even further after year end. So that being said, there's been some key points that have come up in the last year that have provided challenges. The high school being one. Pre-K and K has been very vocal and very active, parents representing their children. And there's been a push for universal pre-K and free full-day kindergarten. There's also been talk with the candidates online about how the young parents need to be able to afford to live in the town. So where my question is can the candidates explain whether or not they support free universal pre-K and free kindergarten and/or how they propose that to be paid for without that affecting the taxes and being able to address the high school challenges on top of that.
Dave?
Our mission statement within the district, and I'll paraphrase, is something along the lines of educate each individual child to its best abilities. I think when you take folks either within a special needs category or a gifted category on the other end of the spectrum. I think when you look at very early childhood education, those, in my personal opinion, are top priorities. As a candidate, if I'm fortunate enough to be nominated, to be elected, it's not really about me, and it's not really about what my desires are. If you ask, do I support equality within Bolton, to have Bolton stack up to the majority of other towns within the Commonwealth of Mass in offering full free day kindergarten, my answer would be yes. When you look at the money we spend to live here, to be a solid step behind the majority of other communities, that's a little hard for me to digest. But that's my direct answer to what is my opinion. That's not how I have acted leading other boards within the town, and it's not how I would act being a member of this school committee. It's about listening to those in the community, finding the consensus, and asking the tough questions as to priorities. If the priorities among the population are for preschool enhancement, kindergarten enhancement, but they are not as much for athletics, then we look at that priority list, and there's your vote. And the reality is, it is the community who should be speaking and making that prioritization, and it is the school committee who should, or any board, whether it's selectmen, advisory, or planning, who is, in our style of town government, pulling the levers. It sounds simple and mechanical, but I believe that's how it works. Folks showing up to meetings every other week, folks getting involved if they're concerned, if they're interested, folks showing up to annual town meetings and showing their vote. That's who is the CEO. That's who is making those decisions. We're pulling the levers. You can't figure out that prioritization if you don't foster a very open environment. I think all of our boards do a pretty darn good job at it. I think we could do a much better job at it. It's hard work. And you can't set an agenda and say, we're probably going to be home in a couple hours if you want to foster that type of environment. There are plenty of nights, Eric can attest to it, where we would go home at 11:30 at night, and I'm not saying poor me, but I would wake up at 3:45 the next morning and drive into Boston. Suck it up. Democracy is about the communication, which leads to the prioritization, and at the end of the day, if that early childhood education is important to the consensus of the population, so be it. That's what we're doing.
Thanks. Mike?
Great question. Obviously well thought out. I'm sure it's something that you deal with all the time. The district faces a lot of challenges. Every district faces challenges. One of the things that the district faces is, of course, fiscal stability. We have, as you said, an E&D, which is basically a safety net if there are excesses or deficiencies, where that money can kind of be shored up or moved into. That is at historic lows at $600,000 this year. I believe it was 1.4 last year. It can only be within a certain percentage of the overall working budget. And so it's very, very low right now. So we have a lot less wiggle room than we used to. There are grants that support special education through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that are drying up. We don't have a revenue stream on that front. We have to, we are currently engaged in trying to institute a digital learning plan and going one-to-one. And so there are demands there. So when we talk about pre-K and kindergarten, there has been a really vocal component of the community that feels as if that the kindergarten should be tuition-free, as Dave mentioned. I am more than willing to entertain any kind of dialogue about how we can justify free tuition with regards to kindergarten, but we have to find opportunities within the budget to allow for that to happen. you know, again, I think I mentioned this earlier, but if you look at each line item can be traced back to students. And by shifting and money from an already tight budget to come 100% from the budget to allow for a tuition-free kindergarten is really, and really, how much does that even cost? We know how much tuition-free kindergarten will cost. Our superintendent has thrown out a number, but it could be considerably higher than that. It could be upwards of several $100,000 to, you know, near $1 million for tuition-free kindergarten. So if that's something that the community wishes, and I trust that there's a collective wisdom within the town, that's great, but we need to sit down and really look at the budget. And we need to ask ourselves, where are we gonna get that money? Where are there opportunities within the budget to sort of take, and shore up that funding? Because if there's not, then we're going in two separate directions. On the one hand, we've got a group that doesn't want to touch the budget. There have been lively conversations in the school committee meetings that I've attended that have specifically said, I don't want to add one more dime to this budget. And that's fine too. But how are we going to afford tuition-free kindergarten? Or in the case of pre-K, how are we going to not raise the tuition of pre-K in 4 years? And then expect families to be okay with a sudden increase of about 32 to 35% in the pre-K costs. I mean, that whole issue left families really vulnerable. And it was really unfortunate. The rollout was really unfortunate. It will always come down to money, and it will always come down to prioritization.
Thanks. Next question for the Board of Selectmen, David?
Democracy is very much in danger all over the world, and there's not much we can do about China and Russia and Turkey and Poland and Hungary, but we'd better be worried about the United States. Congress is deadlocked. There's a growing movement around the country for cities and towns and states to take positions on global issues. And as it happens, we have one of those on our warrant, which is the Paris Climate Accord. I read in the newspaper that Bob doesn't like the word accord, but there are about 200 countries that are members of this treaty or agreement, whatever it is, and they must define agreement and accord in at least 50 different ways. Anyway, it's perfectly clear what it means. And I would like to know if the two candidates for selectmen, what their views are about letting a healthy debate take place at the town meeting, not trying to cut that off by tabling it and that kind of thing. Encouraging a healthy discussion among both the citizens about this all-important global issue of global warming. And what their positions are going to be when the town meeting vote comes up on that issue.
Thanks. Bob?
Well, specifically about the debate, it's on the warrant. As I said, you know, I have a copy of it here. This is the official English translation from the United Nations website. It's the Paris Agreement. The Paris Accord, Honda doesn't sell Accords in France anymore, so the only way you get a Paris Accord is by going to a used car lot. Coming out of the town meeting, that's a legal document, and I think that it should be, if you're going to be voting on it, you should be calling it by whatever the proper name for the treaty should be. Otherwise, it's irrelevant. About the Paris Agreement itself, having read it several times, I can see that there's something in it for everybody. It's a document that politicians love because they can say to environmental activists, look at what we've done to get all the nations of the world to work together to solve the climate problem. To leaders of companies or countries that pollute, the politicians can say, don't worry, there's nothing in the Paris Agreement that affects you. You can continue operating the same way you've always operated. And both cases are true. It has no means of achieving any goal. It has no means of monitoring countries' claims to that goal, and no penalties for moving away from that goal. Most importantly to me, the agreement has only a token concern for human rights. does nothing for those most affected by climate change, and acknowledges impending economic dislocations without specifying any remedies. It's a 25-page document. The phrase human rights appears only once in the document, in the preamble. The word equality appears only once, in the same paragraph. And the same paragraph mentions children once and women once. Thereafter, these topics get no mention in this 25-page document. There can be no discussion about climate change without a discussion about equity and human rights. This may seem silly to say here in Bolton, where no economic effects of climate change can be seen. But in the equatorial regions of the world and less developed countries in the temperate region, any slowdown or drop in world economic growth affects them disproportionately. Every solution to climate change creates economic dislocations that ripple around the world. And while the Paris Agreement recognizes that these dislocations will occur, it is blind to the consequences of these changes. According to the magazine The Economist, less than 50% of the world's population lives in a country considered a democracy. Most of these dictatorships and totalitarian governments are in the same equatorial and temperate countries most affected by an economic slowdown and climate change. The Paris Agreement does nothing for the people who live in these countries. What this document does not say is just as important as what it does say. It does not say that financial and technology transfers should be used to mitigate conditions for those affected by climate change. It does not say that the economic dislocations caused by climate change should be used to improve the economic condition of women affected by climate change. And it does not say that economic dislocations caused by climate change should be used to address the condition of children. We cannot exchange human rights for climate change. We are not being asked to vote only on those parts of the Paris Agreement that we like. We are being asked to vote for the entire document, and we must take into account the entire document when making our decision. The Paris Agreement is not about ending climate change. It's about insulating the powerful and the wealthy from the social and economic effects of climate change. And for these reasons, I will be voting against approving the Paris climate change at town meeting.
Can you answer the second question?
Which was why.
Will you be willing to have a debate, to allow the debate to go forward at town meeting?
Well, absolutely. It's a citizen's petition, and
Thanks. Joel?
you will be guiding the whole process.
Well, I was one of the people who helped edit, I think, the version of the resolution that ended up being put in the citizens petition. I do support the principle of endorsing the Paris Climate Accord, or l'Accord de Paris. Accord and agreement are synonyms according to Webster's New World Dictionary. And in fact, in French, when you say I agree, you say d'accord. I think that it's true that there's a lot that the climate agreement or accord does not recognize, but I think it's also very important that we step forward and say that we in Bolton are concerned with excessive consumption of fossil-based fuels, that we in Bolton are concerned with the long-term effects on the globe. I believe that if people reduce the consumption of fossil fuels in the Western world, because of the fact that we still have, although I don't know how long that will continue, a global economy, there will be shifts in capital flows that will benefit the residents of the Great South, the people in developing economies. And I also think it's important to remember historically that New England's town meetings have spoken out on issues well beyond our boundaries since almost the beginning of the United States. Many New England town meetings sent resolutions to President Madison in opposition to the War of 1812. There were town meetings not far from here that opposed the Mexican War as unjust. There were town meetings that asked that slavery be abolished. And more recently, when the Thetford, Vermont town meeting passed a resolution condemning the war in Vietnam, it made national television and it helped shift the balance against that war, because these were not people with long hair and peace signs painted on their dungaree jackets. These were good, hardworking people in Vermont. And so I think we in Bolton have a right and possibly a necessity to speak out about these issues that are right now being ignored by other aspects of our government. And so yes, I will support that, and I would also support the idea of debate.
Thank you. Okay, it's 8:25. In the interest of supporting debate, I am more than willing to go much longer, as long as anyone wants to go. But perhaps we could do a couple more questions that are a little bit, try and keep them a little shorter. And then we do want to give each of the candidates, in terms
We're
of
just
answers.
getting warmed up here.
We're good to go for as long as you want to go, but except that we might get kicked out of the library. Anyway, I'm just if, you know, I'd like to get a couple more questions, but if we could just try and do, you know, quicker answers on the next couple, that'd be great, because we do want to give each of you a chance to give a final statement as well. All right, thank you very much. All right, now back to the school committee. Yes.
I have a question. I heard Mike, I think, make a statement that concerns me, and I'd like to ask perhaps one of you to address it. I heard you say that you would represent the town on the school committee. And I want to say that back when either Gene Chasen or Roland Miller was the superintendent, I was present. I was part of a small group of people in the Emerson School that were there late at night going through the budget, the school budget, line item by line item, when someone from the Stoll FinCom, actually the whole group of them burst in the room and said, we demand that you cut another $60,000 or something out of the budget. And we said, pull up a chair, join us, because we're going through this line item, trying to figure out what we can cut next. So I'm concerned when someone says they're going to be on the school committee representing the town, because when it comes to fighting for what the school needs, there's going to be plenty of other people representing the town. What I want on my school committee is someone who represents the schools, someone who's standing up for what the schools need, and then can debate with the people on the other committees as to what's affordable and what's not. Not that they think, you know, that they're realistic, but they represent the needs of the school, and then the debate comes from there. Thanks.
Sure. I guess this one's just directed towards me, so that's good.
I'm sorry, I'd like to hear both.
No, that's fine, that's fine.
No, I would
That's
like to
fine.
hear both.
You know, so fundamentally this is a volunteer position. And I understand that I am in a town where community is highly supportive of the district. Of course, I can't always take the aggregate identity of the community and say, here is my position. I think it depends on what issue we're talking about. It really does depend on what issue we're talking about. Can you get more specific with what kind of issue you'd be referring to? I mean, as a teacher.
I remember when Gene Chasen, who was a brilliant superintendent, let go of the assistant superintendent. And he was committed to being here until finally he said, I can't, I have to give up this job. And he said because his wife said all she wanted for Christmas was one day when he could be with the family. And he said when he realized he couldn't, because he had to spend all his time on the school, there just wasn't enough funding in order to have the kind, and then the next superintendent we had actually ended up doing some financial trickery with 2 separate budgets, and the state took us over.
Right.
So I think it's just in principle that we need people there who are defending, who understand and stand up for what the school's basic needs are.
If I'm being perfectly honest, I don't think you will find a better advocate for schools than what I can offer. What I'm doing is I'm coming from an educator's perspective, incredibly supportive of educators, primarily supportive of the academic achievement, the wellness and the safety of our kids, and that ties directly into the community. And so there are so many opportunities where those things kind of come together and represent the same kinds of issues. I guess I'm still a little bit unclear about the specifics of your question, and I apologize if I'm a little slow on the draw. But my whole position is bringing in an educator's point of view, bringing in the perspective of someone who understands schools, and is focusing primarily on that issue. You know, I want to look at the 10,000-foot view of education in this town, K through 12, not individual issues, so much as the overall experience of students and educators in this town, and what our kids are going to look like on the, when they are on the back end of this district after they graduate. What's the product that we can deliver, and how have educators been a part of that process? And how are we supporting educators? How are we going to give educators a voice in the mission of this school and achieving the goals of this school? How are we going to give educators the tools to fulfill the goals that have been set by their school, and in achievement of the goals of the district? So I almost feel like your question is perfectly suited, because that's exactly where I'm at. I'm in full support. I'm sorry, we're trying to keep this short.
Thanks.
Sorry, we could go on about this for hours, but sorry.
Well made. Dave?
Personally, within my own family, I'm enormously vested in speaking for the school. I mean, just look at the facts. My kids are very young. They're going to be here until they're done with high school and within the school system throughout that entire time. Yet I would take an opposite side, because it's not about me and it's not about my family. Wish it was sometimes. That's not the role here, as far as I'm concerned. This member, just like any member on any piece of town government in my mind, is there to represent the town within the district. So it is parents of young kids, parents of middle school kids, parents of high school kids, empty nesters like my parents who are living in town today, people who have chosen to not have kids or simply do not have kids. It's everybody. We're all here, we're all residents. It's my job on any board to sit back and listen and foster discussion. And it's about what direction the town wants to go in. Now, fortunate for you and for those who think along the same lines as you, including myself, schools and education have always, since I've always been here, since I've been alive, the largest priority within the community. So there's massive intersection between those 2 points of view. But in the spirit of democracy and standing away from the matter, taking off my own subjective hat, it's not about me. I'm representing your voice. So if you and your neighbors come to a consensus position, whether I personally agree with it or not, it doesn't matter. It's about what does the town want to do.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, Board of Selectmen. Do we have another question for the Board of Selectmen candidates?
Sorry. Regarding the question around finances, I heard the answer that you would like to increase perhaps the amenities to make our town more, more businesses might come here. But I also wonder if anyone's taken a look at the long-term finances in terms of where our taxes have been spent. I've attended many town meetings where people have voted to put a lot of money to buy property so that farmland could remain farmland in perpetuity. We've paid a lot of money from time to time, so that's going to happen, but that's not going to happen forever. We had a big opportunity this last town meeting, which we voted down last fall, but those big pieces of property are going away, and we took out loans for X number of years in order to pay for them. So I wondered if anyone has looked into when those loans for property will be paid off, at which point we may have some more money available. Not to say we don't also need additional money from businesses, but I'm curious if anyone has that information. Thank you.
Okay, Joel, you're first.
Well, I'm afraid that I can't tell you when they're going to be paid off. Bob is probably more on top of that than I am. However,
I wish that were true.
however, the town's debt load is dropping largely because we've paid off the Emerson School now. I'm not sure what the rest of your question was.
Looking at long-term picture of how we spend our taxes, and are there ways in which going forward we'll have more revenue as things are paid off?
Right, I understand there's a debt schedule. And I'm
Oh,
just
yes, there is a
curious
debt
As
schedule.
to how that's working, and if that's factoring into the.
And the debt schedule is always taken into account in the budgeting process. And right now, our debt load, the trend in our debt load is very favorable. But we're going to be anticipating some significant additional borrowings. You've got the school, you've got the repairs that need to be done, or the traffic calming measures, I would call them, on Route 117. I personally think that we missed an opportunity, but just barely, but that's the way the town voted in not approving the purchase of Camp Virginia. But so many other things have come up since then. I can't answer your question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't have the debt schedule memorized, I'm sorry. There is a debt schedule that's on the back of, I don't know, is it printed in the warrant? It's certainly printed in all the documentation for the advisory committee meetings, and where all of every individual debt commitment is listed out, and how much we're paying this year for interest, how much we're paying for principal, so on and so forth. So I'm afraid I can't answer your question about exactly when stuff rolls off either. I would like to add something to what Mr. Meyerson said about the debt at Florence Sawyer. In fact, something like $526,000 of debt did fall off the books in fiscal 18 this year, and we don't have to do it next year. However, $430,000 of that was paid for with MSBA money. In other words, that was money that we were getting from the state to help pay the mortgage on Florence Sawyer. So although there's a $500,000 drop in debt, there's a $400,000 drop in income, so the net is only a $100,000 difference. But we chewed that up in this year's budget. There was a drop of $100,000 in our debt commitment, and operating expenses used all that up. We do look forward to what we have. Usually the big debate is on, am I going on too long with the detail here, or are you guys okay with that? All right, so there is a lot of thought about the debt when we put the budget together. Thank you.
Okay, let's take one more question for each group, and then we'll do wrap-ups, unless anyone has a burning question that they haven't been able to ask. So the next is school committee. Randy?
Yeah, so we live clearly in a results-oriented sort of society, and I haven't heard either of you speak about sort of, we talk a lot about the cost of education and why people have moved to town. But I'm curious to see both of your perspectives, or hear both of your perspectives on how our standardized test scores match up against the cost per pupil and benchmark against other districts our size, and whether there's a correlation between the amount we spend and how effectively we are achieving test scores.
And that's Steve?
I think the level of excellence that we've had has always been off the charts. But I don't look at that from a very quantitative standpoint, and I will freely admit, I'm not an expert with respect to those statistics. That is not something that I have studied. When I sit back and talk to friends or colleagues about where I came from, the educational environment that I came from within the Neshoba district, I'm very proud. When I talk to friends who are out of town about where I'm raising my kids, what the environment is for both of my kids, I'm very proud to call this home. And I think it makes a lot of sense to live here. You're asking me to kind of correlate that and quantify it.
Well, one of your jobs on the school committee is to monitor the effectiveness of the amount of money that we spend on education. Wouldn't the most one of the most important factors of that correlation be how we do as a district in terms of standardized testing? I mean, it's a fair question, right? I mean, that is sort of where the rubber hits the road. I mean, there's clearly facilities considerations, and our facilities need improvement. But I would, maybe I'll ask the question differently. What would you say to those who believe that the amount that we spend per pupil or on the district as a whole hasn't always correlated to the best test scores compared to other districts that spend a similar amount of money?
I would suggest that the measurement of the excellence, of the standard of excellence, is far beyond just the test scores. My own personal opinion. I think that's a good number and a good correlation to look at. I don't think it paints the whole picture. I am a little disheartened by the condition of the property up on Green Road. And I am encouraged to see that we're taking all the right steps in a very methodical way to see what we can do about repairing or replacing it. Not just from an efficiency standpoint, but from a standpoint of excellence, to bring it into the 21st century. Does that mean more spending in the long run? It probably does on the capital. Does it mean savings in terms of efficiencies, throwing good money after bad at a facility that's not operating efficiently? It probably does as well. So I think there's a lot of hard work to do there to keep those costs in line. But I think the level of excellence is there, whether the test scores correlate to it or not.
Doug,
Thanks.
can I just add on to that question, because I'm a little confused on his response.
What's your point of order?
How is he measuring excellence if he's not measuring it in test scores? I mean, what is your measure of excellence then?
The whole student. It is this. So Joel Bates will talk about his goal being work very well, do great things, and be kind. And I think all of those things are not quantifiable at all. I think there's some merit to stacking it up against test scores, but how I was raised, that's not the end-all be-all. I think a little bit of a qualitative, beyond just a quantitative type of a measure, is valuable.
Thanks, Dave. Mike?
So, excellent question. The fiscal year 17 budget, embedded within it is a table that describes what our costs, our spending per pupil is as of, I think, 2015, and we were right around 14,000. And that's commensurate with other districts that share the same, relatively the same size budget compared to the number of full-time employees. And so I'm going to align myself with Dave because I think that the test scores, particularly MCAS scores, only tell part of the story. My last check with MCAS scores was that we were at a high of about 80% proficient in MCAS scores at the secondary level. So very, very strong MCAS performance, directly correlated with our cost per pupil. But does that tell the whole story? I don't think it tells the whole story. As an educator, I don't put, I don't throw all of my weight behind standardized tests. I think in a lot of ways they're culturally biased. I think standardized tests cater to some students but not to others. And if we're looking at the whole pupil, if we're looking at the whole student, I would very strongly suggest looking at the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. which talks about how kids handle stress. It talks about substance abuse within the district. It talks about anything from diet to the relationships that they have, and those are the metrics that I put a lot of faith in. We would look at cohort graduation rates, there are other performance indices. All of these things put together tell the story about how successful we are as a district. And I don't think that looking exclusively at standardized testing tells a complete picture.
Thanks. Okay, last question for the Board of Selectmen candidates. Anyone have another question for them? If not, we can go to final statements. Okay, we're gonna go in reverse order from how we started. So we started with Bob and went to the left, so we'll start with Mike, and if you, about 3 minutes.
Sure, yeah. Thanks again for the opportunity. The first question that someone asked today was about my experience or lack thereof in local government. I do not approach this position from the perspective of a political perspective. I am fully admitting that I'm approaching it from the perspective of a teacher. And I think that given Dave's background and my background, we are really approaching this from different angles. And so I think ultimately what this will come down to is how the community chooses to see the role of a school committee member. I see that my role is simply an extension of what I've been doing for years in the classroom. And I am the first to admit that I would be focusing on student achievement, student health, and student safety. As a school committee member, that's where my expertise lies. I think that's where I bring the most value to the town. Other members bring other strengths, and I intend to balance that out with my own perspective. And I think that that has real value to the town. We've talked a couple of times about, someone mentioned what the next step is. There is no next step for me. I'm doing this because I fully believe in what I'm doing. I'm not doing this for posturing. I'm not doing this to assume another role in the town. I'm an educator at heart. I've always been and I always will be. And I feel like my impetus for doing this is coming from a genuine place, and I hope that I can have your support and that I can have your vote come May 14th. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have a website or any way
I do.
people
I
can
have.
reach you if they have other questions?
Sure. I have a Facebook page. Sure. Yep. I have a Facebook page. I have a newsletter that goes out to subscribers. Let's see, my Facebook page.
I'm sure they can find it if they go.
They can find it because it's public access. Yeah, and I've encouraged that there's a section in there that solicits feedback from the community so that I can offer sort of my perspective on it.
Great, thanks, Mike.
Sure, thank you.
Dave?
Thanks. Our government in Bolton, like many small country towns in New England, is an all-volunteer government, and it's a pretty special thing. Everybody who's at this table and many people who are in the room don't get paid very well to do this, but it's something that we do because we care about our community, and it very much is volunteerism. I think especially at a time when our national stage and the divisions within the national stage are pretty ugly, I'm very proud to call this type of town my home. And I think the key to it is something that I believe in very much, and it's not idealistic. It's something that we worked very hard over the past few years in the planning board to foster, and that's relationship management. It's coming together with the community and having conversations so that folks always feel comfortable that when they see an item on an agenda, they want to come and give their 2 cents. And it doesn't turn ugly as it does sometime in the national stage. Sometimes it does, but I think folks realize that we're all here to do the best thing for our community. And I think it's a wonderful thing. So from me, I'd ask that you take a look a little bit at my track record. That's always been a very important thing to me, that level of openness and of dialogue. I think we do a pretty darn good job at it here in Bolton. I think we could always improve. My website is whydave.org, and very, very much appreciate everybody's consideration.
Thanks, Dave. Joel?
First of all, my name is Joe, not Joel, but.
Sorry.
I've had to put up with that all my life. But now, I would say that I see myself primarily as a communicator. I have been a journalist for most of my life. I've covered town meetings in 4 New England states. I understand town government, and I would say that I think if there is any weakness in our current government, it's outreach to the people who didn't show up here tonight. I don't have any magic solutions, but I think we need to convince the residents of this town that town government is open to them, responsive to them, and I promise that whatever opinion you bring before me on the Board of Selectmen will be listened to with respect, and if my opinion is in the minority, I will just move on. We've had some divisions in town. I think they're finally healing over something that happened 3 or 4 years ago now, and it's time for us all to move on and for us to get as many new residents or younger residents involved in attending town meeting, in volunteering for town boards, in voting in town elections, and in finding out just exactly how Bolton runs. And I think they find it runs very well.
Thank you, Joe.
I've been involved in town since I came here, started with the long-term planning, and again, with my own kids. I have a lot of experience dealing with the financial aspects of the town government. I've been chairing several committees in town government, as well as, again, in the school district. I think I'm the only person that I know of that, as a sitting selectman, I was asked to participate in a formal process with the school committee, which I was honored to do. That being helping with the statement of intent, statement of interest. I'd like to continue contributing to the town. I believe the focus of a selectman should be to execute on the wishes of the townspeople as expressed in town meeting. I think there have been a tendency for selectmen in the past to act more like city councilors, who are political animals, who are elected for their political prowess. But I believe that the political will of the town is expressed in the town meeting, and that it's the job of the Board of Selectmen to execute against the will as expressed at town meeting, and that is what I would intend to do. So I would appreciate your support in May. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank all 4 of you. Thanks to the Friends of the Bolton Library who sponsored this, and thanks for everyone for coming out. And make sure you come to town meeting and town elections.